Today's seminar is a joint seminar between Lewis Silkin, Frankfurt Kernet and Gala. We've been joined also by Dominic Murphy from UKI, and we're here to talk about keeping children safe online, and particularly looking at what the games industry are doing in respect of this. In terms of who you've got on your panel today, well, we've got Dan Goldberg and Gregory Boyd from Frankfurt Kernet Klein and Seltz. They both advise a huge amount on this area. Dan particularly from a privacy context and Greg from a games context. Dan, in fact, heads up the privacy practice at Frankfurt Kernet, and Greg heads up the interacting entertainment practice. So you are in very good hands. I've also noticed from a bit of an online Google search, Greg has also written quite a few books on the area. So really great to have him involved. From our side, you've got me, Bryony Long. I head up or co-head the data and privacy practice at Lewis Silkin. And with me, I've got Nick Allen, who heads up our interactive games practice. And like Greg, Nick is knows all things of games. So between us, I think we've got some valuable insight. But most importantly, the piece de resistance, some might say, is that we've also got Dominic Murphy with us, who is Head of Policy and Public Affairs at UKI. For those who are not familiar with UKI, UKI stands for UK Interactive Entertainment, and it's the largest non-for-profit trade organisation for video games in the UK. So Dominic does a lot of work advising members on some of the issues that we'll be raising today, and also doing a lot of lobbying work in some of the regulations that are up and coming that we'll also be touching on today. So I will let Dominic say a little bit more about himself when we introduce him later on, but that's who you've got on your panel. So hopefully a decent crew. So in terms of this seminar, what we're going to obviously focus today is on sort of a brief overview of the requirements. We're going to try and keep this as snappy as possible, because what we really want is questions. We've got a great Q&A session coming up where we're going to get some real insight about really what's happening in practice. I think should be familiar with the law, particularly after Dan and I do our little bit. But really, I think what you guys are kind of wanting to know is what actually is the practical reality and how the law should be interpreted. So we're going to go through a lot of that later on. So in terms of why are we here today, I think protecting children online is clearly a concern that is close to many of our hearts. And in an online world, it's becoming increasingly challenging to protect children against online content. Unfortunately now, saying to kids just you can't use the computer is no longer, well, I mean, some kids might be a bit more tolerant, my kids certainly aren't. So I think we need to now look at ways that we can protect them and control them, and put in place things that are important. Sorry, jumping on to the next slide here. We've got some pretty important people giving some pretty important quotes. So we've obviously got Joe Biden, whose actual view is he wants to do a blanket ban on serving ads on children. Some might say that's a little bit OTT, but fundamentally it's clearly an issue that's close to his heart. You've got John Edwards, who's the ICO Information Commissioner in the UK. He is making it very clear that he sees protecting children as a real top of his agenda issue, and it's an issue that he feels is a global problem which needs a global solution. And if UNICEF point out at the bottom here, clearly children are more vulnerable, and it's more difficult for them to understand how their data is used, and therefore that is why we really need increased protection for them. So I think while everyone in this virtual room probably agrees that we need increased protection, I think the key is around proportionality and how we can do it in a proportionate way that allows businesses aimed at children to keep going. So I thought I will briefly touch upon what's happening in the UK, and then Dan is going to walk through roughly what's going on in the US. So in the UK, we have the main piece of legislation that regulates children's data, or the use of children's data, is the ICO Children's Code. Now, this is all the age-appropriate design codes. Some refer to it as AADC. I personally refer to it as the Children's Code. The Children's Code is a piece of guidance that sits alongside the statute, so it's not binding in the same way that the UK GDPR or the GDPR is binding, but certainly you need to be in complying with the provisions as much as possible, because it's basically where the regulator's head's at in terms of compliance. The code mainly designed so that children are, well, anything that is aimed at children is default off when it comes to sharing their data. So unless children are aware that their data is being shared and make a choice about to actively share it, everything should be turned off. And that is kind of like the fundamental principle of the Children's Code. It's high privacy by design when it comes to collecting and processing children's data online. The code is effectively 15 different standards, and it's, all of which are aimed at protecting children. The code came into force in 2020, and it had a sort of 12-month transition period, which is due to end September 2021. We are also, due to end, it has ended even, so it's been in force for over a year. But we actually have a review coming up in 2022, so it will be interesting to see, what, if anything, changes. So far, there has been quite a focus on what we would call the higher risk sectors. So there's been a lot of work done with the games industry in particular, trying to find solutions that work. But we haven't as yet seen a huge amount of enforcement on the code, and we haven't really been given a huge indication that there is much to come. I think the UK ICO, John Edwards, is very keen on ensuring the right behaviour from the outset. So working with companies and games organisations in particular to come across with compliant solutions from the beginning, rather than watch them fail and then find them later, which is a much more pragmatic approach and is probably a slightly different approach to maybe some of our European counterparts. So in terms of the principles within the code, we've got, as I said, 15 different standards. I'm going to briefly trot through them, but as I say, only very briefly because I've only got a limited window in which to speak. But the core principles we talk about being in the best interest of the children. So that means that any decisions you make has to be in the best interest of the child. It doesn't necessarily mean that your commercial interest will conflict with the best interest of the child, but to the extent there is a conflict, the best interest of the child needs to prevail. The next principle is you must be doing data privacy impact assessments. Again, for the games industry, they've done a specific guidance on how you do one, which is specifically tailored to the games industry. But data privacy impact assessments are effectively assessing how you collect and process data in connection with providing services online to children, looking at the risks and working out how to mitigate them, and then putting in place measures to mitigate them. And so anyone who is has a site or offers a service aimed at children online will need to be doing a DPIA and making sure that they're hitting all the requirements of the code when it comes to compliance. There's also the concept of age-appropriate application. So effectively trying to take steps to recognise children's ages and then design the service accordingly. There's the concept of detrimental use of data, so you shouldn't be using their data in a way that is detrimental to their well-being or goes against industry codes of practice. Data minimization is around obviously only using as much data as you need and not collecting more than you need, which is a fundamental principle of UK-EU data protection law. Then in terms of service design, we have transparency, which is around making sure that children are really aware about how their data is being collected. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later around how the practical side of how that's being done. Geolocation data, so making sure that when you are tracking children using their geolocation, that is an active choice, that children actively opt into being tracked. And when you no longer need to track them, you turn that off. There should never be a default automatic on for tracking when it comes to using children's geolocation data. There's also things about parental controls, so really trying to ensure that parents can step in if needs be, but also making children aware of the fact that their parents can step in when needs be is also equally as important. There's nudge techniques, so looking at techniques, making sure that you don't do anything that is nudging children to unduly give their data over to the organisation. Equally, they also talk about positive nudge techniques, so making sure that children are nudged to making the right privacy choices. Must confess, I haven't seen that many positive nudges just yet. And then they talk about online tools, so things to make sure that children can easily access their data, they can exercise their rights in respect of their data. And then the third kind of category of the standards is key data processing activities. So the concept here of policies and community standards are basically making sure that all organisations uphold their policies and the community standards that they set when it comes to using their online service. Their default settings, which I mentioned at the outset, which is one of the key principles, they need to, as everything needs to be on, i.e. high privacy on by design. So to the extent children are required to do anything or hand over their data in a way that's not absolutely necessary for the provision of the service, they need to be electing to do so. It can't be a default option on, it has to be some form of election. Same with data sharing, you can't be sharing data unless the children has actually elected for you to do that. Profiling is another key one. Again, profiling comes in very many different forms. Some profiling might be necessary for the purpose of the service, particularly, for example, if the service is aimed with children with a disability, you might need to do profiling of the child to work out whether they have a disability and whether the service is appropriate. However, there's other profiling, which is what we normally think of when you're profiling for commercial use, for targeting. That sort of profiling has to be only done, again, with an opt-in, and it has to be very clear to the child this is going on and the impact of it. And then there's also specific things around connected toys and devices. This connected toys and devices, I'm not going to go into huge detail, but that sort of warrants special protection on the basis that the data that can be collected by them is can be vast, and therefore special protection is required. So in terms of practical how you comply with the Children's Code, we've got some steps here, but effectively you need to be doing your market research, ensuring you have supporting evidence to determine whether you're in scope in the first place. The code is designed for all children under 18. There's a lot of work that's being done to try and figure out if your website or service is designed or aimed at children. You need to familiarise yourself with the relevant resources. The ICO in particular has a huge amount of resources. It really has stepped up a gear in terms of really trying to get to grips with how organisations can comply practically with this. Establish a multidisciplinary team. So it's not just a legal and compliance issue complying with this code, it's a technical issue. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about the practical technical aspects of it later on. Doing your DPIA, which is an absolute must. Ensuring to update your compliance roadmap and learning from best industry practice, seeing what others are doing. And hopefully this session today is going to help you see what people are up to. In terms of other laws that we just thought we'd just trot through briefly, there are various advertising rules within the UK specifically aimed at protecting children. You've got the CAP code and the BCAP code that have specific provisions around ensuring that advertising content does not cause harm to the children. There's a whole sort of sections on it, and as I say, I'm not going to go into that in detail now. There's also guidance specifically about recognising advertising for children, and where you need kind of enhanced transparency. Nickelodeon, for example, have been in trouble a number of times by not making it clear enough that what they're showing is advertising content. Even actually, to be fair to them, they have had advertisement at the top of their content. It's not been in the right colour. It's not looked clearly as an advertisement, and therefore they've fallen foul of the code. There's also various art guidance that we have around restricting what ads can be shown to children in terms of the types of products, so for tobacco, alcohol. Then there's also guidance specifically on advertising in games and making sure you've got to be very careful that you haven't got a direct exhortation to children to encourage them to purchase. Again, we might touch on that later. There's also the high sugar content ban on, well, it's not actually come in, it was going to come in and it's been delayed, but there are still specific provisions around promoting FHSS products to children. And then finally, although it's not quite the EU, I thought it would be worth just mentioning the Digital Services Act. Sorry, it's not a UK Act, it's an EU Act, but I thought it was just worth mentioning because I think the Digital Services Act is aimed at platforms providing online content, and it does have specific provisions in there around children and what you can do in terms of your digital service to children. So things like you need to have enhanced transparency, and one thing it's talking about at the moment, we haven't got the finalised text, so we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but they are talking about banning children's ads banning targeting children using special category data. So again, might not be so relevant for a number of you on this call, but certainly something that the EU are taking very seriously, and I think we'll see the EU standard here being almost applied as a global standard going forwards. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was the proposed online safety bill. This is something that Nick is going to talk to a little bit more around our Q&A session. But effectively, this is a bill that's been proposed by the UK government to address a number of things. But one of the things is about protecting children from harmful content. It's going to capture sort of user-to-user services where you can sort of provide online, you can upload content. It's also going to capture pornographic sites and yeah, any platforms that make online content available. It's effectively got effectively its rule is around making sure that if online content is harmful, that it is taken down and making people accountable for that. In terms of, as I say, I'm going to trot through because I started a little late, so I will let Nick talk about it in a little bit more detail. But effectively, there are additional duties as well under the proposed online safety bill, which will be specific to platforms that are aimed at children, so enhanced protections that they will get. I think I'm going to stop there and hand over to Dan. So Dan, here we go. Off we get the US side of the pond.
Thank you, Bryony. That was fantastic, and thank you so much for the warm introduction. Again, I'm Daniel Goldberg, Chair of the Privacy and Data Security Group here at Frankfurt Kernet Klein and Sells, and I'm joined by my partner, Greg Boyd, who will talk to you more specifically about gaming issues. I am looking to see if I have control now, I think, of the slides.
If not, Dan, I can
Yeah.
talk over it.
I got it. Cool. Thank you so much. Okay. So, of course, we're going to talk about U.S. privacy law, and I'm going to try to do it as efficiently as Bryony just did with regard to the UK. So, of course, we have to start by talking about COPPA. COPPA is the privacy law that everybody here is familiar with respect to governing personal information of children. It has been around for 20 years, and so it is one of the oldest privacy laws, and it predates all the comprehensive state privacy laws we've been thinking about, predates GDPR, et cetera. So again, this is essentially the standard on which we've all operated for many, many years. As a quick recap of COPPA, COPPA allows for penalties in connection with it, and it is actually one of the laws where there definitely is teeth to this law, and this is an area of law that regulators are routinely looking at. So it is very important for companies that are involved in this space to be compliant and address compliance with COPPA. With respect to the obligations under COPPA, who does COPPA apply to? It's any online service that's directed to children under 13, or an operator of an online service that has actual knowledge that it's collecting personal information from a service directed towards children. So I've underlined, the important concepts here directed towards children. What is that? That is essentially a factor test where we look at a bunch of different factors to say, is this a site that, again, is something that children would be expected to be going to? With respect to the actual knowledge standard, this has been actually one of the critiques of COPPA over the year, is that it's not a constructive knowledge standard, but it's actually knowing. But if you are a service that is provided in connection with a service where you know that that service is directed towards children, you are held responsible for that. So that kind of comes up if you're an advertising network and you know that you're running ads on a website that is directed towards children, the data that comes from that is subject to COPPA and you need to comply with the obligations. So with respect to the specific obligations under COPPA, of course, you must provide specific notice with regard to personal information you collect. You have to obtain verifiable parental consent before collecting personal information unless an exception applies. Again, I've underlined these concepts because they are really important about the concepts about verifiable parental consent, as well as exceptions. You have to provide levels of parental review and choice. You have to limit the amount of data collected. And of course, you have to maintain reasonable security. The FTC has actually established an online COPPA FAQ, which I think is a fantastic resource for companies. So for anybody who has not seen that before and is involved in this space, I highly recommend you take a look at that. So some of the issues under COPPA that come up routinely, and again, I know this is familiar for many of you on this call, a general audience site is a site that is not directed towards kids, and in that context, you can age gate it. So you can just say, no one under 13 can come to this site. A site directed toward children is what I mentioned before. And then there's this concept of a mixed audience site, which is a site that is directed toward children, but the primary audience is not necessarily children. And I actually think that's a really important one for the video game industry specifically, because so many of the games are ones where we know that there may be children on it, but again, children might not be the primary audience. And in that context, you can have a neutral age gate, but you can't completely block children from accessing the online service. So verifiable parental consent is one of the big issues that I mentioned, and this is always is the hurdle to address how to actually get that level of consent, and there's all different ways to get it. So many companies try to rely on exceptions, and so one of the main exceptions is the support for internal operations exception, which allows you to collect a persistent identifier if it is being used for one of these purposes here. Again, targeted advertising is not one of those things that you can do in the context for support for internal operations, but data analytics, authentication, other things are. So this is one that we see a lot of video game clients focusing on. And I reference here, with respect to getting verifiable parental consent, there are many vendors out there that offer these services. Super Awesome has a free service called Kids Web Services. So a lot of companies have been looking at that recently. Some other important laws to reference in connection with children's compliance in the US, comprehensive state laws. So you have California, CCPA and CPRA, and there are specific obligations around sales of information. You have to get consent for children under 13 from parents. And for kids 13 to 15, you actually have to get opt-in consent to sales as opposed to opt-out for all other demographics. Virginia, Colorado, Utah, and Connecticut also have codified specific obligations around COPPA into the code. Student privacy laws is an area that is really an emerging area in the US and has become a really big area of enforcement. FERPA is a federal law that governs student records, and there are, I believe, like over 40 state laws at this point governing a collection of student data. And in the context of this, we're talking about K through 12 schools for the most part that are taking some type of government money. In the context of that, there are specific obligations around how data can be collected, but where we see this come up a lot is if there's a video game, some type of company or platform that is trying to come up with a deal with the school to offer the game within the school, there are restrictions on how they can use the data and what those contracts need to look like, specifically prohibitions around sales, targeted advertising, and profile building. And of course, I can't give this presentation without referencing the FTC Act and consumer protection laws. So there's been a lot of recent action here. As Brian referenced, the president recently gave a statement talking about the importance of protecting children's information. The FTC also issued a policy statement earlier this year talking about the importance of protecting children, specifically in the ed tech context, which I was just talking about. We've seen some other specific enforcement actions by the FTC. This one with regard to Weight Watchers I thought was really interesting because in the order, not only did it require them to delete the personal information that had been collected, but the algorithms that had been derived from it. So discussion about benefits that companies can derive improperly from collecting personal information. And of course, we've seen a few actions this year from KRU, which again is not just about privacy, but it's also around advertising. So for that, I want to bring Greg in for a moment to talk about KRU and give some background.
Thank you, Daniel. I'll do this one slide. I think Daniel has one more to wrap it up, and then we're going to go to questions. So fair warning, audience, put your thinking caps on and take full advantage of this really wonderful panel. So KRU is interesting, and I'm not going to say it's unique, but it's U.S. only. It stands for the Children's Advertising Review Unit. Some elements about KRU. First of all, it's a nonprofit. Second of all, it's independent, so it's not a government agency. And third, as Daniel mentioned, and I'm just going to repeat, but it bears repeating, they do both children's privacy and they also do unfair and deceptive advertising practices. They police essentially all media directed toward children. Comic books, television, radio, and of course the internet and games all fall under the purview of KRU. And KRU is voluntary. Some people view it as well, it's not a great day if you get a KRU letter. I mean, that is true, but it's so much better than getting an FTC letter, and it's so much better to work it out and get all of your practices into compliance with CARU so that you do not get one of the potential consequences of not sorting things out with CARU, which is a referral to the Federal Trade Commission. One other thing I will say to honestly really plug CARU, two things. One, they have a COPPA safe harbor, so you can do pre-screening. You can go through them with your privacy program. The ESRB also has one, and fall into a COPPA safe harbor. And I guess secondly, well, you know what? I think that's enough good things about CARU for now. We'll stop there. In short, view it as a consumer protective organization and also as a service. I remember the last thing I was going to say. The CARU guidelines are enormously short, very readable, publicly available, and they revised them pretty recently. I think they were revised in 2022. Less than 10 pages. Check them out. Okay, Daniel, last slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to wrap this up. What's going on right now with regard to the law that's upcoming? There are a number of proposed reforms, and I think that we are moving towards some type of either an amended version of COPPA or perhaps other laws that are going to augment COPPA. So at the federal level, there are at least 4 bills right now being considered, two of which amend COPPA, 2 of which augment it. And there's questions here about whether or not there's going to be a private right of action. Greg referenced the safe harbor. Some of these laws are saying that we got to get rid of the safe harbor. So there's all different types of questions about what this is going to look like, but they're moving pretty quickly at this point. On the California side, we have 2 laws that again are moving quickly. One is the Social Media Platform Duty to Children Act, and that one is really around regulations for social media sites. And the other one is the California Age Appropriate Design Act, which again is very similar to the ICO's Children Code here, which we're all familiar with or getting more familiar with over this call. And so I do think it is very likely that we are going to see some change, a big change to privacy law in the context of children within the coming year or 2. So with that closes out our general kind of introductory session, and we're going to go to Q&A. And Bryony, I'm going to punt it back to you here to ask the questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys. So yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to go into a Q&A piece now and get some, as I say, practical thoughts about some of the issues that we've cantered through, galloped, some might say. If you do have any questions, though, please, if you could put them in the chat, and we do have a lovely Stacey monitoring that, and she can flag if there's anything specific, and I'll also try and keep an eye out. But we do also have a few questions that we just wanted to ask as well. But yeah, please do put your messages in the chat, and we will try and answer them if we can. So the first question, and this is where I'd love to introduce Dominic again. As I say, we're very excited to have him on the panel because I think he's going to give some really interesting sort of industry stance on some of the issues. But I think, Dominic, hate to put you on the spot, but in terms of your view, how do you think, I know I touched on it pretty briefly. In fact, actually, no, I'm going to ask Nick this question first because I think you're going to give a little bit of an overview, Nick. How do you think, in your view, has the online safety bill sort of landed with the games industry, and how are people responding? And then Dominic, I want to come to you as well to get your view on it as well.
Well, thanks, Bryony. So I think it's potentially going to be quite a significant piece of legislation for games companies if it goes through. I mean, social media companies and other big platforms are probably going to be the biggest target, but the games industry is probably up there in terms of focus by the government, and it's quite likely that the regulator, Ofcom, is going to be taking an interest to ensure that games companies comply, especially any sort of high-profile AAA games with large numbers of players. And part of the reason I say that is that the games industry was a significant focus of the Online Harms White Paper and the UK Parliament's inquiry into what it termed as immersive and addictive technologies back in 2019, which is the background to the current online safety bill draft. And during that process, various games companies were called into Parliament to give evidence. I mean, just to go into a little bit more detail of how it's going to affect the games companies, they're going to be any game with a multiplayer mode or other way for players to share user generated content is going to be caught, and they're going to be classed as category 2B companies. We think that's how it's set up in the bill with different categories. But digital distribution of single player games is probably not in scope. And if it does go through in its current form, then as category 2B user-generated content companies, they'll have various statutory duties of care to protect players from harming one another, which is a bit of a change if you think about it, legal duty from just ensuring that as a company you don't harm your players, whether that's in respect to their personal data or consumer laws and so on. It involves duties to monitor, actually prevent and minimize and take down illegal content. But in respect of children, it goes even further. So it also means all of those duties, but in respect of content that's not illegal, that is legal, but what is classified as harmful. And that's rather difficult to work out what is actually legal but harmful. So, I mean, most games, have a bit of a problem with what we call player toxicity in the industry, i.e. people giving each other verbal abuse and so on. In the anonymous nature of the internet, and online games is no exception to that. So it's going to put games companies in quite a difficult position to try to work out in legislation what it is they need to proactively actually prevent other players from seeing if they're likely to be accessed by children. So you might think, well, okay, threats to kill, something like that we can monitor for, but it's not very clear in legislation, for example, how it might deal with online game behavior such as like griefing, it's known as. So it's effectively a sort of online bullying within the game. So to take an example from the Children's Commissioner's website, they refer to an interview of I think it's a 12-year-old or something, who was playing Minecraft online and spent about 6 months building up a realistic football stadium, which then got burnt down. So, I mean, that's all within the rules of the game, but could that constitute harmful content to that child? It's really difficult to say. But it's all extraterritorial. It's like GDPR and consumer laws. So it doesn't matter if you have a corporate presence in the UK. If you're a games company or another online service that falls within scope, then and you've got players or users in the UK, and if you've got a significant number of children users, you'll also have those additional duties. So in terms of how the industry is responding, I think it's fair to say that at least most of the bigger companies with online games are actively tracking the online safety bill, especially those based in the UK or EU. Though, as with most regulation, my impression is no one really wants to be the first mover and go and invest a lot of time and change a lot of processes just yet. People are waiting to see how the bill evolves and if it gets amended further, if it comes to pass at all. But I don't think it's going to be possible to ignore it completely. And as you mentioned before, there's things like the Digital Services Act in the EU that is going to introduce some similar duties in respect of legal but harmful content. So it does seem to be the direction of the travel on both sides of the Atlantic. And companies are just going to keep having to think about how they're going to invest in technology or change their systems in order to comply with this. And I'm sure that's only going to increase as time goes on and the bill becomes in more final form.
Yeah, it certainly will be interesting to see how it progresses, because I think one of the things we all thought it was all guns blazing, and I think with the changes that have been going on in the UK from a political perspective, it's maybe something that it does get kicked into the long grass and may suffer a sort of similar fate, I guess, to the Digital Economy Act a few years ago. But Dominic, do you have any sort of thoughts on how you're seeing some of your members responding to some of the provisions?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think industry has been sort of broadly welcoming of the principles behind the bill. And I think it's probably fair to say that actually with sort of a lot of focus on online safety and, newly coined phrases like the metaverse, I mean, but games have actually been sort of creating these online communities for a long time. And I think has generally been a bit of a trendsetter. And sort of Nick touched on it a bit there, that people are sort of investing in bits like technology, but also, companies do invest in content moderation, things like chat filters, and other sort of aspects of this, and also develop sort of AI to, help, try and find or track some of this harmful content. So generally, I think there's quite a good story to tell from industry, and actually can share quite a lot of best practice in this sense. I suppose the reservations maybe that the industry are sort of I suppose expressing to government or to Ofcom, sort of part of a long consultation process, is really about some of the categorization and I suppose some of the sort of unknowns of the bills that they assume or think they'll be in sort of category 2B, and so there'll be sort of certain obligations on them. But ultimately, quite a lot of things around these legal but harmful bits of sort of content that they'll have to tackle. Some of that's being left up to sort of secondary legislation. Some of it's coming more detail in, say, codes of conduct that are produced by Ofcom. And I think a lot of people would just like certainty from this point. And obviously, the extra degree of political uncertainty and whether the actual bill makes it through in its current form, it certainly doesn't help in terms of preparing and getting some of those things in place. So I think it's one of those ones where broadly in favour of and actually preparing for it. And some of the bigger companies, the AAA companies, have a lot of these procedures in place. There are also things like parental controls and other things that are in there at a sort of platform level. But generally, there's a little bit of wait and see, and I certainly think they would like a bit more, I suppose, clarity from the regulator and government so they can start preparing for this. But I suppose that's similar to everybody, and everyone is sort of holding their breath about what actually happens to the bill when Parliament comes back next year, or not next year, after the summer.
Yeah. And likewise, Dominic, with the children's code, I think a number of us have been slightly surprised we haven't seen as much enforcement, or even kind of echoes of enforcement or threats of enforcement from the regulator. Do you think that's because people are doing a pretty good job at trying to get their hands around complying with it, or is it perhaps our regulator is just being a little bit lax, or yeah, how do you find that the games industry was responding to some of those provisions? Because certainly when it came in initially, it really did set hairs running for a period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't think it's lack sort of regulation necessarily. I think, and from my experience, certainly a few people have gone through what they would consider an audit, but have had like quite detailed discussions with the ICO about sort of what purposes they're collecting data for, how they sort of anonymize or minimize that. And I think going back to your point right at the very start about how the ICO are taking an approach where they're trying to sort of tackle issues and understand industries at the start from the outset to ensure that maybe there's not as much of a compliance burden down the line, I think certainly seems to be true for now. I mean, having looked at sort of the ICO's forward-looking strategy, I think there was a bit of an onus on trying to understand the industry a bit more and doing a bit more of this sort of going forward. But certainly from some people who I spoke to, that they've actually had the ICO in looking at some of the development stages of games to show some of those features. And I think actually from the games industry in particular, even though they sort of come up as one of these sort of risky sectors, by and large, generally, a lot of games companies do not collect a level of data that you might assume that they do. A lot of it is telemetry data. It's aggregated. It's often around gameplay, and it's not necessarily around personal special protected characteristics or anything like that. And often it's collected with the purpose of improving the game itself. Sometimes sort of weeding out bugs and issues that are in there, or changing it to sort of better player experience. So I think the industry has been, pretty collaborative with the ICO over the past few years, particularly when sort of the implementation period came in. So I think it's a degree of understanding one another better. But I hazard a guess that there might be a bit more of this sort of, I suppose, a closer look at the industry sort of from the autumn onwards, as per the ICO plan.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. Moving over to the US side, Dan, what are you finding are kind of the main operational issues that gaming companies are facing when it comes to complying with COPPA? And I think there's a specific question actually in the chat that says, what are the most common and most alarming missteps or mistakes from US clients? I don't know if you can wrap those two together.
Perfect. That's great. So I mentioned a few of them when I was showing the prior slides about what was underlined. One question is for game companies, is the game directed toward children or not, right? That's a fundamental starting point. And that might not be something as easy as you think it is, where you're like, okay, well, of course it's not, but then you start actually looking at the characters and you go, well, wait a second, like when you look at the totality of all the facts and the circumstances, maybe it is. Maybe it's a mixed audience site. And if it's mixed audience, right, that comes up with this whole question about how are you going to operationalize it and how are you going to build it out? And so you have the option to either get the verifiable parental consent, or alternatively, you can create two different versions of your site. And so that's a really interesting thing of your game, is creating an adult version versus a child version with different experiences. And what happens if your game is based off of advertising monetization, right? And so if you have a child version of it, you're going to be far more restricted in what you can do with respect to advertising than you can in the non-child directed or the non-child version of the service. So it's just a very complex thing with all these different constraints and considerations that you need to have. Those are kind of the points that I see companies looking at. But I'd say, again, a big question comes down to, do we want to do the verifiable parental consent? How do we operationalize that? If not, can we rely on an exception? And if we are going to rely on an exception, how do we create different experiences for children versus adults?
Yeah. I want to add something, if that's okay, Bryony. The most common and alarming misstep that I see is quality supervision of vendors, especially in ad buying, especially in programmatic ad buying, because we don't have to post the Lumascape here, but a lot of people on the panel, certainly everyone on the panel and a lot of people in the audience will know what that is. If you're monetizing a game through advertising and you're doing programmatic buying and you get a cannabis ad served to a 12-year-old, you can't just go, whoa, it's complicated. That sucks, I'm sorry, right? Like, just because we're now doing so many things through essentially AI mechanisms and, let's be honest, loosely understood and loosely controlled mechanisms, it doesn't lower the standard for what we have to do for children. And I'll say a second issue, it's more of a policy issue, it's more aspirational issue, and it begins to touch on Stacy's question down below. A 5-year-old isn't a 12-year-old, and I sort of want to treat their data differently. I mean, I want to protect all children's data, but my kid's 3. I don't think anybody should ever advertise anything to my kid or have any of his information. But if he were 12, he should start to have some agency. I don't know how to build that in, right? And I think when we're looking at the legislation, no one knows how to really build that in well. But at the same time, building it and also admitting it's a real thing are two different parts of the discussion. And we can't begin to build it until we at least admit it's real. Like, I think everyone, when they poll their intuition, would agree that 3 or 4 or 5 feels different than 10, 11, or 12.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess interesting from our perspective, I think, over here, while we have, a pretty high set of standards when it comes to particularly using children's data, in terms of compliance, and I mentioned at the outset, and there's a question specifically aimed at this, so I wanted to capture this, but, from our perspective, there is certainly an element of proportionality. Do you think that gets applied over in the US, or is it much more sort of strictly enforced and regulated?
Daniel, why don't you do that one?
I think it's one of these concepts that, so going back to talking about the children's code and everything and talking about enforcement of that, and what's so interesting about how US privacy law has evolved is so much of it is actually stemmed from EU law, right? If you look at CPRA and CCPA, well, definitely not perfect, and there's a lot of issues with it. A lot of those concepts come from GDPR. And with the new Virginia privacy law, those concepts also come from GDPR, right? Some people call it like a mini GDPR. So with regard to the concepts of proportionality, I agree, that is not something that we've really seen currently in the law, but especially with this proposal with respect to the children's code coming down the line, and other laws, and they're getting amended regularly with the various proposals, I would not be surprised to see some type of concept actually that transfers over to our law. But at this point, to my knowledge, that's not really a concept that we have.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's I guess bad for the US, maybe slightly better for the UK and Europe. Well, maybe actually not so much in Europe. They don't seem to have quite the same lean towards proportionality as we do in the UK. Moving slightly more onto kind of areas of focus. But one of the questions that we were talking about when we spoke last week was some of the dark patterns that we're seeing emerging and why they're a concern. Is that something you could give a little bit more flavour
Sure.
to?
I'm happy to talk about that just for a minute. I mean, so it's one of those new hot words, period. I think it is newly addressed or a newly coined term for an old thing, and it's really deceptive design. I'd encourage everybody to read a couple of articles on dark patterns just for the names of the type of dark patterns. They have names like privacy zuckering and roach motel. I would go so far as to say no other element of the law or no other element of regulatory, has as entertaining names as dark patterns. But essentially, a dark pattern is anything that fools a person, child or not, into doing something that they don't intend. So for instance, if you're doing an advertisement for a game, and I've actually seen this advertisement, and there's a web in the upper right-hand corner in white, and that's also where the X is in white, and you're like, where is the X? It's hidden by the web. That would be a dark pattern. If you end up accidentally sharing more information than you meant to, that's privacy zuckering. If you end up going down some hole that you can't back out of, that's roach moteling, also a type of dark pattern. So in any event, I think dark patterns are generally, and think about it as unfair deceptive design. It's an issue for adults. It's certainly an issue for children, and I think it's something we're going to see a lot more of in the future.
Yes, it's also a hot topic on this side of the Atlantic as well. It's part of the EU's Digital Services Act, and our UK consumer regulator, the CMA, put out a discussion paper very recently on what it calls online choice architecture, which I think is just simply a more neutral term for dark patterns. And it's interesting to note that in that discussion paper, the CMA actually referred to virtual currency as being itself a potential type of dark pattern or online choice architecture, because it disconnects the player's appreciation of the real world value with the virtual item.
Right.
And I just,
so you can say something, Dan?
oh yeah, I just wanted to add, this concept of dark patterns also is extending into comprehensive privacy law in the United States. So dark patterns is a concept that has come up in the CCPA regs and again in the CPRA regs, and there's very specific obligations around it. And as Greg was saying, again, it's this concept about trying to push somebody to do something that otherwise they probably wouldn't do. And I'll give you a really good example of like where I always see this are these cookie consent notices that you have, where it's like you go on the site and in order to proceed to do anything, you have to click I agree. And then if you try to say no, you get like 3 more prompts that say, are you sure you want to say no? Are you positive you don't want cookies? And like, that's the exact thing that I think is a really easy, like low hanging fruit that if I'm a regulator and I'm going to be looking at a site to say like, is something compliant or not? And I see this, I'm going to go, whoa, like this is a company that is engaging in dark patterns. And then you start looking more in depth and going from there into other issues that, could be more problematic.
Yeah. So, in terms of, I'm conscious there's a couple more questions that I want to get through, but one of the things, and I don't want to sort of link them together, dark patterns and loot boxes, but one thing we did just want to touch on since we've got Dominic on the line is this obviously has itself been quite a controversial area, loot boxes, particularly when they're aimed at children. What's the latest position there? Does that kind of sort of fall into the dark pattern or not so much?
Actually, the point that Nick made there about, I suppose, the aspect of that is sort of virtual currency. So sometimes, loot boxes, and for those who are not aware, it's essentially a sort of a randomized game mechanism that either you sort of purchase or you can sort of achieve through sort of hours of play or skill, and it's often like a power up or something, a bit of armor or a pack of players in a sort of EA game, as it were. But that's either bought for actual currency or converted into a virtual currency. So one of the things that's come out of the recent, I suppose, call for evidence response that we've had in the UK, which has been going for the past 2.5 years, are sort of questions over potentially having a clearer link between real currency and virtual currency, so people sort of understand the actual real world value of the purchases that making. But I suppose the other issue on that is that essentially they're not considered to be gambling in UK legislation because there's no cash out value. You can't sell something, or you can't take money out of the game, as it were, from one of these items. So the other argument on that side is that ascribing it a real world value potentially gives it one more step closer to having a cash out ability, which is against sort of terms and conditions. But there are some sites where you can try and do that. Obviously outside of the actual proper terms of the game itself. So we've got this sort of situation now where the government is very concerned. It has been concerned for some time. It's got to this point where actually, it said it's now time for industry to sort of clear up its act and come to some sort of set of proposals. And some of this is about also, there've been criticisms about it being, I suppose, how these things are marketed. So like limited time offers only and things like that. Run out to get this power up or something similar to that. So they've now pushed it to industry, saying, well, actually, you're technical enough, you're clever enough, you're innovative enough. Can you come back with a set of proposals? Which essentially means that some of these things are turned off without full parental consent by default. Is there greater information campaign around sort of consent, player controls, spending controls that can be put in for parents as well? And so they want really an update on that sort of process by the next 6 months or so, by sort of Q1 next year. So there really is, I suppose, a last chance, but also an opportunity for industry to sort of show what it can do in this area and sort of show some of the additional protections. Because I think what came out of some of the evidence was that there's high awareness of things like parental controls. They're just not necessarily turned on. And so, some of this is around information as well as putting in some of the, additional features.
I want to say quickly, if it's okay, Brian, just 3 or 4 things in the US. Like, whenever people hear loot boxes or call me or my partner Sean Kane, who's really the better of the two of us, if you have a loot box question, and ask about loot boxes, the sort of the default fear is that this is bad and we should not do it. And I think that's a healthy feeling to come to the table with. But the thing I want to say, especially in the US, is there's a lot of loot box things that you can do. And I want to reiterate some of the things that Dominic said and maybe add 1 or 2 more. So did you have to put cash in to play the loot box? Does it generate something that has cash out? From a player happiness perspective, is the benefit cosmetic, or are you doing some kind of pseudo gambling mechanism where you pay to win, which is a dirty word among players and among the industry? Are there spending caps? Here's a very popular thing on both sides of the pond. Do you publish the probability or possibilities of getting things in the box so that people aren't just clicking and it's completely random, or they have no understanding of what they might get? So the more information that you put associated with the loot boxes, the more control that parents or even players have over the consumption of loot boxes, the less likely you are to have a cash out mechanism. All of those things make these safer and safer and safer. The issue with it in general is, we know on an industry level, they're really good for making money because people like to take some chances, right? And they don't even mind knowing they're likely to lose, but there's a chance of winning. And in fact, knowing they're likely to lose when they occasionally win, it makes it feel better. So this is deep in our psychology, and it makes it tough to design and tough to regulate.
Thanks, Greg. So I guess one of the 2 more points that I wanted to touch on before we go. One, I think that a lot of people, and there's a question talking about it, but I think age verification is obviously a big issue. And, we're seeing some organisations in the games sector implementing various different types of technology, some going further than others. Are we seeing any kind of emerging practice of what's becoming a bit of an industry standard when it comes to age gating, or have we still got quite a lot of work? And there's a specific question here around the outright games carry action, which talks about the design of Brat's game age gating mechanism that obviously was on the wrong side of what was right. But is there any things that we're seeing that can be neutral and that ultimately are working?
Let me talk for a second about the outright games action, because I think that's a really interesting one. And this goes back to a concept, right, that if you look at the COPPA FAQ is covered and has been covered for a lot of time, it just was in a little bit different of a situation here. So in the course of this, allegedly, outright games actually had 2 age gates. One was for children, and then once children got past the first one, then there was actually a parent gate. And pretty fundamental issue here, but for the first one, if you indicated that you were under the age of 13, it would not let you proceed, right? And if you tried to close it and go back again, same thing, would not let you proceed. But if you made it past the first one and went to the second one, and you input that you were under 13 for the parental consent, and then again, it would not let you proceed, and then you put it again that you were over 13, it would let you proceed at that point. So KRU found that this was problematic because, again, a child could essentially click in what's equivalent to a back button to enter a different age. And so again, that's like a very basic tenet of neutral age gates, is that you have to make sure, and a lot of times this is done through like a cookie drop or something, that if you're trying to, that if a child, understands after the first attempt that that didn't work because they input the wrong age or an age that doesn't get them to the next level, they can't just click refresh and go forward to it. So I think that's a really important takeaway here. And again, anybody who's interested, like, take a look at the COPPA FAQ. I think it gives really great examples here. So it even says an example of a neutral age gate is one that allows a user to freely enter the month and year of birth, right? So you put it in there, you avoid encouraging children to falsify their age. So you shouldn't say, this is only permissible for children or for adults, that type of thing. So you just have to be really careful in the way you lay it out. Greg, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just 30 seconds. I mean, and I feel like I've been saying this since the early 2000s. What is your birthday? Don't innovate here. I don't want to hear from your designer at all, and cookie it so they can't do back and they can't do refresh. Whenever I start to get like design thoughts on the age gate, I'll talk to you for $1,000 an hour about why you can't do this, but like, why are you doing that to yourself? You know what I mean? The fact's completely clear. No one cares about this part of your game. Spend that design time on any of 1,000 other better decisions. There's no reason to put yourself near the border of what could be wrong. I mean, let's just do it like that. It's 2005. Go ahead.
And one thing I just want to add on to this too is it's the same thing with the context of verifiable parental consent, right? Again, I direct everyone to the COPPA FAQ, it sets out what the FTC has recognized as okay for obtaining verifiable parental consent. There are still a number of companies, right, that I've talked to that go, well, we want to do something original, we want to do something unique. And I think that that's the type of thing, you don't want to stray too much from the norm. Like, there are a lot of mechanisms available with respect to verifiable parental consent. Make sure you do your homework and your due diligence, and you should, follow the trend of what other companies are doing.
So from
So, and I was just going to say, we are at time, sadly, and I think a few people are beginning to drop off. So I guess one of the things we just wanted to kind of wrap up on was, I think one of the questions that we get asked a lot on both sides of the Atlantic is, there's a lot of laws out there, particularly from the US COPPA, you've got the UK's Children Code, you've got EU implementing things. Where should we go to first? What should we start? Where's our bottom line? Where's our baseline? And I guess, Dan, I know you've got a view, but where do you think the baseline is, and what should people be doing?
So this is the most complex question, I think, in 2022, is how do you harmonize, right? We have so many laws. We've talked about GDPR, there's the Children's Code, there's CPRA, there's now all these other comprehensive laws, there's COPPA. So what do you address? And I mean, the short answer is, right, you have to address everything, but you have to do it on a risk-based approach, looking at, what jurisdictions are you located in, and looking at, I'm always like, which regulation is the most comprehensive, which is the one that is going to restrict your practices the most, and look at that as like the baseline and then go from there. I still think that COPPA, even though, while it's not perfect, is considered a standard around the world. And so I would tell all companies that if you are dealing with the US at all, you should be very closely looking at COPPA, especially because we know that within the US, it's an area of law that regulators are looking at. And as we've seen in the past year, it is actually, there are enforcement actions brought based off of that. And of course, based on that, you kind of level it above and what the various respective obligations are.
Yeah, for sure. And I would agree with that. I think obviously from a Children's Code perspective, we have got various requirements, but I think in terms of, hardcore compliance, I think COPPA or the US are certainly, FTC are certainly enforcing a lot more than we're seeing at the moment. So where we're sort of more being guided quite gently. So I think it's trying to find a balance between the two, but certainly keeping a careful eye on COPPA is I think the message. we're going to stop there, I think, just because it's run over time. But really, thank you so much to everyone on the panel. I personally think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope everyone else agrees as well. And yeah, thank you very much for attending. And sorry we're slightly over time. If you've got any other questions or any follow-ups, by the way, please email. I think details somewhere, and we can always follow up with anything specific. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.